You're watching C-SPAN 2, created for you as a public service by America's cable TV industry. Next, a look at the United States' relationship with Saudi Arabia. After that, a speech by the incoming British Conservative Party leader, Michael Howard. And later, a House committee investigation into the financial collapse of Health South.
Good afternoon. On behalf of the Understanding the Middle East Club, we'd like to welcome you to our second event. I'm not going to take up too much time because we want to begin with our panel, but we just wanted to inform you of our upcoming events. We hope by the end of this semester to conclude the second half of our Palestinian-Israeli discussion. We're waiting for an Israeli speaker, but we should have something set up by the end of the semester. And we're hoping next semester to continue with a series of more interesting panels, such as we hope you'll find today's panel to be, and we hope you'll continue to attend. If you'd like more information about what's upcoming, please contact one of us, and we'll get you on our mailing list, which we do promise will be up and running by the end of the semester, hopefully. So without much further ado, I wanted to introduce Les Janka, who's going to be moderating our panel. And I should mention he's not only a SAIS alum, but a former assistant dean, so we're very happy to have him here today to help us with our discussion. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Dalal, and thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to be back in my alma mater, and it's great to see so many students, other parts of the SAIS family here on a Friday afternoon. There is hope after SAIS. Only 7 years after I graduated from SAIS as a Middle East Area Studies major, I was working on the National Security Council in the White House. So there is hope that your SAIS degree will take you somewhere, and I think it's a reasonable hope that the White House will be in different hands in 6 years from now or 7 years from now, so keep your hopes up. Our topic today is really an important one, and I think it's particularly important since just yesterday, President Bush gave a very major policy speech focused pretty much on the Middle East. When he said something like 6 decades of failure of American policy in the Middle East, this caught my attention because a number of those decades I was involved with American Middle East policy, as many of us on this panel were today. And I had to think back how much we would really call it a failure. When I think of Saudi Arabia, I think of Saudi hosting U.S. strategic bombers during the Cold War, being a reliable supply of energy to the West during the entire Cold War, of consistent support for American policy throughout the region, a very good customer of the United States. Nevertheless, the events of 9/11 quite legitimately ask many Americans, how can it be that this supposed ally of ours could contribute 15 out of the 19 terrorists who attacked us on that terrible day? And since then, there's been quite a bit of discussion of Saudi Arabia and U.S.-Saudi relations since then, and I'm delighted that SAIS has picked up the topic. You may look at our panel and say, well, but there are no Saudis here. We'll talk about Saudi Arabia today, but what the focus of our conversation is going to be on U.S.-Saudi relations. And some of the key questions I want to introduce our discussion with and have our panel address as we move through it. Questions such as, how much does Saudi Arabia matter to the United States? And why does it matter? What are the prospects for stability in Saudi Arabia? Particularly the question of succession in the royal family. What is the role of Saudi Arabia? What role are they playing today in the war on terrorism? And with these questions in mind, then what should U.S. policy be towards the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia? And if this relationship is, quote, a vital one, why hasn't the Bush administration done more to defend it, given the many attacks that have occurred on it in Congress, in the media, in public discussion since September 11, 2001. So with these major questions in mind, I'd like to introduce our panel. They will speak in the order that they're sitting here to my right, and I'll introduce each of them as they come up. I've asked each of them to speak for about 10 minutes, and we'll go completely through the panel, setting the broad picture. Then we'll come back to your questions, and we'll continue the questions as long as you have them. Our first speaker will be Thomas Lippman. Tom spent more than 30 years with the Washington Post as a writer, editor, diplomatic correspondent. He's also an author of a number of significant books, such as Madeleine Albright, who also sat right here in this room with me as a Sci student. Madeleine Albright and the New American Diplomacy, Egypt After Nasser, Understanding Islam, and he is currently working on a book titled The American Experience in Saudi Arabia. And also, one way of organizing the panel is sort of in the order of which we have been most recently in the kingdom, and I think Tom probably wins the prize for all of us of being there the most recently. So Tom, can you give us 10 minutes, please?
Thank you, Les. Thank you, Les, and thank you all for coming. I appreciate your interest in this very important subject. Keep in mind as you listen to me that I spent most of my professional life as a journalist, which means I was an observer and an inquirer. My fellow panelists were practitioners, which means they knew more before they got out of bed every morning than I was ever going to find out. So you should listen to me with that, from that perspective. I set out a little over 2 years ago to examine the entire history and nature of the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia. And I did that because I read in close detail the various iterations of bin Laden's manifestos, and in my view, we are not guilty as charged, and you can go through the entire bill of particulars. And I thought that it would be useful, and when my book comes out in January, I've tried to go through as much of that history as I was able to put into the space that was allocated by the publisher and I was able to find out. And I think that in order to talk about where we're going from here, it's useful to look at how we got to where we are and where we've been in this relationship. And everyone should understand that the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia has been and is much broader and deeper and involves much more spheres of human activity than people are commonly aware of. Oil was the start, oil is not the finish, and certainly goes far beyond oil and defense. And I thought what I'd do is, first I brought a prop, which to sort of illustrate what I'm talking about. There's a silver coin in this little display case here. This is a silver Saudi Arabian rial coin. It was minted in Philadelphia in 1944. And the reason the coin was minted in Philadelphia in 1944 was that during World War II, the government in Saudi Arabia faced a severe financial crisis. Saudi Arabia, even in those days, had two sources of income. The early phases of the oil industry had begun to produce export earnings for the kingdom, but most of the kingdom's money came from tax on pilgrims to Mecca. And during World War II, there were very few of those. And the result is that the king did not have the money that he needed to run the country, to hand out the largesse to the tribes that were the basis of his power. And that was the beginning of the point at which the United States, which had previously left the management of strategic affairs in the Arabian Peninsula to the British, during World War II, the United States began to develop a strategic interest in Saudi Arabia. We got permission from the Saudis to build the air base at Dhahran to serve the Asian theater of the war. And it became apparent that the United States, in order to maintain a new ally that we had in Saudi Arabia, needed to get involved with the management of the country's fiscal affairs. And so first the United States lent the Saudis a huge amount of silver bullion, and then the United States minted that silver bullion into coins, and which became the currency of the kingdom. The reason that it's in this commemorative case is that the first shipload of those coins, 4 million of them, went down in the Gulf of Oman when the ship was torpedoed by the Germans. And only many years later did a diving expedition retrieve any of them, and this is one of those. So having sent the 4 million and lost them, we had to do it again. But what that led to was a direct involvement by the United States in the financial affairs of the kingdom, originally in the person of a gentleman named Arthur Young, who was dispatched under Truman's Point 4 assistance program and who basically created the Saudi Arabian Monetary Agency, or the Saudi Arabian Central Bank. Arthur Young was a very experienced international financial management type. He had previously been the financial advisor to the nationalist government in China. And he created the Saudi Arabian Monetary Agency, which today, of course, is one of the premier central banks and financial regulatory agencies anywhere outside the OECD. Now, that led me to the realization that the United States and Americans and American corporations and American agencies involve themselves in Saudi Arabian life in ways that have had a profound impact, I would say, on both countries. And let me just give you a few examples of what I found out. The relationship began not with the signing of the first oil contract, but with the work of medical missionaries from the missionary hospital in Bahrain that was established at the beginning of the 20th century by the Reformed Church in America. And as far as I've been able to find out, the first Americans King Abdulaziz ever met were doctors from the Bahrain Missionary Hospital who were allowed to come into the kingdom. In fact, they were requested to come into the kingdom where medical conditions were terrible. People suffered from tuberculosis, malaria, all kinds of chronic diseases. And the doctors would come in for weeks or even a couple of months at a time and treat the people. They were not allowed to preach, of course, nor were they allowed to establish a permanent presence. But they did introduce the king to the notion of people who would come from across the sea and not be Muslims and who would give without taking to the people of Saudi Arabia. And in my opinion, laid the groundwork for the king's favorable view of Americans that was partially responsible for the granting of the oil concessions to American instead of British firms in the 1930s. So if you begin with the medical missionaries, and you see that the involvement of the Americans in stabilizing the financial situation in Saudi Arabia, then you get into a whole list of things, of ways in which this relationship worked. The Americans, for example, created what is today the, I think it's the King, I forget which king it is, University of Petroleum and Minerals, which is the premier institution of technical knowledge and engineering knowledge and higher learning in the kingdom. It was created by Americans, and the curriculum is in English. And it was done partly because Ahmed Zaki Yamani, then the petroleum minister, or about to become the petroleum minister, could see the day when the Saudis would need technically trained people to run a nationalized oil industry, which indeed is what happened. In the 1960s, it became apparent that as the income in Saudi Arabia increased and as the educational levels increased, the Saudis needed to develop a government, a basic bureaucratic system that was competent to run a modern country, which they didn't have. And so a team from the Ford Foundation spent 13 to 14 years in Saudi Arabia trying to establish a centralized personnel system and a civil service, and set up training programs and a centralized payroll and recruiting system for the Saudi civil service. Now, ultimately, the Ford people failed for a variety of reasons, but when you go to the Ford archives at the Ford Foundation in New York, although they're archives of failure, they're fascinating archives of failure, and they tell you a lot about the interplay of attitudes between Americans and Saudis. As many of you may know, and as I knew even before I started this, Saudi Arabian Airlines, which is the largest airline in the Middle East, was essentially a creation of and a subsidiary of Trans World Airlines for many years. The pilots, the administrators, the maintenance people were Americans. The training program was American. The aircraft were American. That airline grew out of the original gift of a DC-3 that FDR gave to King Abdulaziz at their famous meeting in 1945. And I'll just add one more point about this. One of the most interesting people I met in the course of my book was a woman named Mildred Logan, who today must be close to 80, still alive, lives in Texas. Mildred Logan went to Al-Kharj in the desert southeast of Riyadh in 1951, I believe it was, when she was a young woman. She was 23 years old. She had been teaching school in Texas. And she took her daughter and she went out there to join her husband, a man named Sam Logan. And what was Sam Logan doing in Al-Kharj back in 1951 or 52? He was part of a team of Americans who were managing the Royal Experimental Farms at Al-Kharj. And those Americans were part of a fundamental American involvement in the development and expansion of Saudi agriculture. And agriculture today is the second largest component of Saudi GDP, and I believe is the largest domestic employer. Agriculture is a huge industry in Saudi Arabia, and a lot of what the Saudis knew, they learned from Americans who brought in farm equipment and powered irrigation and modern fertilizers and even chicken incubators. You know, I've read several accounts of how fascinating it was to the Saudis who'd never seen such things to see chickens come out of a machine and all the same color. But it was very basic techniques of agriculture that today are a fundamental part of the way Saudi Arabia works. So just to come back to my starting point, this is a complicated and multi-layered relationship, and it has survived 70 years, in my opinion, to the benefit of both societies, despite periods of mutual aversion and the very fundamental social, political, philosophical, and religious differences between the two peoples. This is a relationship that now, of course, I think is undergoing its severest test, certainly its severest test since the oil embargo in 1973 and 1974. But it's a relationship that should not be written off or thrown over the side. We don't want to throw this baby out with the bathwater in the fight against terrorism. And there's too much at stake. Even now, the commercial relationships are almost as important to us as the political relationships. So Les began by asking, how much does Saudi Arabia matter? I would say that it matters a lot, economically, strategically, and politically, and it would be to our detriment to blow that relationship up. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Your talk prompted a couple of flashes in my own memory about Saudi history. I remember reading that when the kingdom was founded in 1932, the largest import to the kingdom was oil from Pennsylvania. So, secondly, you mentioned Al-Kharj. When I was in the kingdom last year, we visited Al-Kharj. And where you spoke of the Ford Foundation experiment being a failure, the American agricultural contribution is a considerable success. In Al-Kharj, I visited the world's largest integrated dairy with 36,000 cows. That's a lot of cows. It's enough to make a Texan weep. But again, Tom is quite right that agriculture is a very major part of Saudi Arabia that too much in the American stereotype we think of as unending sand. Our next speaker is General Paul Schwartz. Paul retired from the U.S. Army after 32 years, served all over the world in a number of key capacities. During the Desert Shield, Desert Storm period, he directed the Joint Operations and Intelligence Center for our coalition armies. He also lived in Saudi Arabia for 8 years as military advisor to the Saudi military, and since retiring from the U.S. Army, has worked with a couple of American companies supplying equipment and training to the kingdom. In my book, Paul is one of the real American experts on the U.S.-Saudi relationship. Paul?
Thank you, Les, and thank you all for coming today to participate in a very timely and significantly important subject. I don't consider myself an expert, although I'm flattered by that term, and I'm very suspicious of those who present themselves as experts, particularly on the region and particularly on Saudi Arabia. I have had exposure over there. When I went in, I certainly knew nothing about it. I went in on 1 day's notice. I came out on the Brigadier General's list, and before I was promoted, the Pentagon called me. I was at home in Milwaukee with my mom and dad about to celebrate their 50th wedding anniversary. Phone rang, it was the Pentagon. They tracked me down to Milwaukee, and they said, "Good news, Paul, we got your first assignment." I said, "Yeah, where?" "First assignment as a general." I said, "Where is that?" "Riyadh, Saudi Arabia." I said, "Where is Riyadh, Saudi Arabia?" I had been a NATO Cold War warrior since entering the Army as a second lieutenant, and worked myself up through the various military units, and came out on the general's list and got assigned to Saudi Arabia. I did get a 3-day cram course here in Washington, D.C. I got off the plane, reported to Crown Prince Abdullah, and saw the ambassador. The ambassador was my boss. The country team concept was very much alive, and so I went to school while I was working, and I learned it was kind of a working program of an intense importance, very important, and very revealing. As Les indicated, I think I have a unique background from several aspects. I spent 2.5 years as advisor to Crown Prince Abdullah, who commands and has commanded for 35 years the Saudi Arabian National Guard. The Saudi Arabian National Guard is a full-time force. Their primary mission is internal security. Their secondary mission is external security. And during Desert Storm, Desert Shield, they came to execute that secondary mission very much. So I was an advisor to Crown Prince Abdullah for 2.5 years. Enjoyed the unique opportunity to meet with him one-on-one with an interpreter on whenever I felt it was necessary. His door was open. And so that really boiled down to about once every 3 to 4 weeks, maybe a short meeting, maybe a long meeting. I feel I have a sense of the man. I have a sense of him as an individual, what his value systems are. He gave me guidance, a lot of guidance, things he wanted done in the National Guard, and he asked our assistance on doing that. The U.S. Army has never commanded the National Guard of Saudi Arabia, should not even move in that direction. They should give, as they have for about 25 years, advice, assistance, opinions, and feedback to Crown Prince Abdullah and his senior National Guard leaders. I enjoyed that relationship. That tour was very, very profoundly important. Several years later, when I left very satisfied that we had done a reasonably good job. Relationships were strong. This was pre-terrorism days. That had not come there. This was the mid-1980s. I went back for the Gulf War because of that experience, and as indicated, I was co-director for operations and intelligence of the Arab Islamic Forces. I reported directly to General Schwarzkopf and directly to his Saudi counterpart, as you may recall, Khalid bin Sultan, General Khalid bin Sultan. That lasted about a year. There was a well-known ambassador sitting up at the table here during that period of time who provided a national treasure, who provided guidance and momentum to both the U.S. effort and particularly to the coalition effort, and that very difficult glue that hangs those things together. After that, I retired. I went back to Saudi Arabia as a civilian and was a technical assistant to the Ministry of Defense and Aviation for the acquisition of the M1A2 tank. Why I mentioned the word unique, there are very few Americans who get to operate and get exposed to the National Guard under Crown Prince Abdullah and the Ministry of Defense and Aviation under Prince Sultan, the Minister of Defense. And I had that, and so I have a good feel for capabilities and how those two organizations function and operate. Now let me say and make this point, both of those are the premier military forces of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Both of them are loyal. I've had people question and ask me, are they in existence so that they might oppose each other in some dreamt up scheme of competition between Abdullah and Sultan? And I would dispel that notion. Those are two separate military organizations that have separate missions and separate histories. The National Guard is, in Arabic, it's called the Harat al-Watani, the guardians of the nation. They have their origins in tribes that rode with the original King Abdulaziz when he created the nation of Saudi, when he unified the nation of Saudi Arabia 60, 70, 80 years ago. I want to get now to, that's a little bit of background. I think it is unique, a total of 8 years over there in batches and wearing different hats, doing different things, but giving me exposure across the spectrum of Saudi Arabia, from businessmen to government officials to third country nationals to Saudi Arabians citizens and certainly to the military side of things, but not just the military. You can't live there 8 years without making friends in all walks of life. What are my observations on Saudi Arabia? I put a few notes together last night, and I would echo points made here earlier. The nation-to-nation relationship is in transition, and the outcome remains uncertain at this time. I crossed out the words because I thought they were a little too strident. I crossed out the words describing the relationship as frayed, tarnished, bruised, and beaten. That might have been, I think that would have been appropriate 6 to 8, 10 weeks ago, but I think there is, for very good reasons, a lessening of the acrimony, a lessening of the finger pointing. I think that has settled down a bit for obvious reasons, and I don't see it. But I do think the relationship is troubled, and it should not be. But it's understandable as to why it is. Sustaining the relationship is essential for at least 3 reasons. The first reason, you know the numbers. Saudi Arabia sits on 25, 27, 28% of known oil reserves. You're very familiar with those numbers. I don't have to go into those details. The world is dependent. The world as we know it, the Western world as we know it, is dependent upon access and a reasonable price to those oil reserves. And that is not going to change anytime soon. The second reason it's important to maintain a relationship with Saudi Arabia is that Saudi Arabia is the home and the custodian of the Islamic religion. This has come home to the United States. Not only the leadership, but the citizens throughout the United States, is the critical importance of maintaining a dialogue with the Islamic religion. And if we're to live up to our own values and our own national institutions, maintaining that dialogue, maintaining that relationship is absolutely essential. That can hardly be done without maintaining a relationship with Saudi Arabia. Lastly, the maintenance of the relationship is important because Saudi Arabia, though it does not directly control countries in the region, countries on the peninsula, doesn't directly control them, it is a huge influence on what goes on within the region, what goes on within the Arab and Islamic world. Witness Crown Prince Abdullah's recent peace initiative and the fact that there was not one voice in opposition to it. In fact, he had garnered support for it. He had gotten a very strong coalition of the region before he presented that peace initiative. Where it goes remains to be seen. Continued, a couple more observations. The U.S. is seeking internal change within Saudi Arabia regarding democratization, transparency in government, economic process transparency, human rights. This has all been front page stuff since 9/11, and it's not going to go away. And the U.S. is seeking internal change in all of those areas simultaneously. At the same time, it's seeking Saudi financial and political support for the war on terrorism and the war in Iraq. This presents an understandable problem internally within Saudi Arabia. Despite that, I read in the paper, and you all did too, recently Saudi Arabia has pledged $1 billion to the reconstruction of Iraq. Despite the pressures from the United States, which are causing internal difficulties, they still stepped forward, one of the few nations, to ante up major resources in response to the U.S. request. Talking about change within Saudi Arabia, I saw it in the 8 years I was there, all moving in the direction that the United States has defined as being favorable to sustaining the relationships. But change, of course, is not occurring at a rate which satisfies all of the proponents for change within the United States. I have been watching, studying, and reading these past several years, and it is my opinion that change is occurring within Saudi Arabia within every spectrum of social and economic and governmental life. And I don't want to really go through those bullet by bullet, but that is in fact underway, has been underway, and will continue to be underway. I would like to make the final point is that the unconstrained criticism in Saudi Arabia, of Saudi Arabia, and in Saudi Arabia too, but the unconstrained criticism in the United States on radio talk shows, on television, in books, pamphlets, magazine articles, that criticism is not serving a good purpose. It's serving a very, very harmful purpose. Yes, it will be there. It can't be controlled. I'm not calling for the fact that it's ever going to be channeled or controlled, but is not serving any positive purpose whatsoever, and is creating a sense of unnecessary and unwarranted pressure within the Saudi society, and pressure for change coming from outside. The obvious response and reaction to that is self-evident. In summary, after 20 years of involvement with Saudi Arabia, including 8 years of living there, with exposure and personal involvement across a wide spectrum of Saudi life, our nation-to-nation relationship is now troubled. Citizens and governments of both countries have no choice but to work through the current crisis and sustain the relationship. There is no alternative. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, for insights into the U.S.-Saudi military relationship. It reminded me of the period when I was in the Pentagon working in the Middle East office of the Pentagon, and one of our major jobs there was working on the arms sale relationship and the arms supply relationship to the kingdom. And fairly regularly I would get called up to Capitol Hill, and some senator or some congressman would spend a short time beating me up about why are we giving all of this equipment to Saudi Arabia? Why are we giving them these tremendous air bases and military bases? Why are we giving them all this stuff? And I had to explain to the congressmen and the senators that no, we're not giving it to them. In fact, they're paying for it. They're paying cash in advance, in fact. And I guess part of my job was just to get a beating from Congress. I think it still goes on for some of my colleagues in the Pentagon. But it felt awfully good during the Desert Storm, Desert Shield period to see all of that American equipment of our military going into Saudi Arabia, landing at air bases that were made to American specifications with supplies of American parts, all the sockets and plugs fitting precisely. And then as Desert Storm took off, to see American equipment in the hands of both our American military and the Saudis moving hand to hand together to liberate Kuwait, it gave me a good feeling and sort of a sense of wanting to go back up to Capitol Hill and say, Senator, we told you so. You still want to do all the criticism that you did. We also have to note the fact that all of the American involvement in Desert Storm, Desert Shield was reimbursed by the Saudis. They paid for it. And in talking to some of my recent friends in the Pentagon about what went on during the American invasion of Iraq, I asked them, I said, well, there were some reports and strains and stresses with the Saudis and the use of their bases. And my friends in the Pentagon basically said, every single thing we asked for from the Saudis, they gave us. There wasn't a thing that we needed from the Saudis that they didn't readily give to us. So I think it is a very important relationship, and I'm glad we have Paul Schwartz here to underline it for us. Our next speaker is Ambassador Charles Freeman. Chaz is president of the Middle East Policy Council. Ambassador Freeman also served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs and served as General Schwartz has mentioned, served as ambassador to Saudi Arabia during the Desert Shield and Desert Storm period. But Ambassador Freeman is much more than a Middle East specialist. He served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. He was Chief of Mission in our embassies in Bangkok and in Beijing. And I first became aware of his many, many talents when I was on the National Security Council in 1972 when Chaz served as the American interpreter for the late President Nixon's historic visit to Beijing. So, Chaz, podium's yours.
Thank you. I'm going to try to be brief, both because I wasn't really aware that we were to make opening remarks until I arrived, and also because, well, I guess if I'm brief, I'll be a bit superficial, but that really doesn't bother me at all. And in fact, I was once told by a wise man from the East that if something is worth doing, it's worth doing superficially. He was from SAIS, actually, the East Coast of the United States. I am actually a little bit reluctant these days to speak to American audiences about Saudi Arabia, because I find that in the audience there are people who can rehearse the details of the educational curriculum in Saudi Arabia and tell me what was allegedly said in which mosque on what date, by Imam so-and-so. And there's an enormous body of knowledge out there, obviously, on the part of people who've never been to Saudi Arabia, don't speak Arabic, never met a Saudi, but they know a lot, because the conventional wisdom about Saudi Arabia is now ubiquitous, and everybody knows all sorts of things about Saudi Arabia. I can say honestly that I didn't know a damn thing about Saudi Arabia before I went there. In fact, my proudest achievement in 30 years of the Foreign Service prior to that was not to have served in the Middle East. After all, why would you want to? It's the region that originally gave hypocrisy a bad name. And anybody who's been anywhere near it knows that in the summer, living in Riyadh is like living in a hairdryer. So why would you want to go there? Like Paul, when I was in Maputo, Mozambique, and received a call from the White House asking me if I would be enthusiastic about going to Riyadh, it took me about 15 seconds to develop the appropriate degree of enthusiasm for the task. And when I got there, I discovered something that I have discovered everywhere I've been, namely that virtually everything I thought I knew about the place was wrong, or at least not accurate, and that Saudi Arabia was a very strange place indeed, quite different from what I had imagined. When I arrived there, Saudi Arabia was the fourth largest exporter of wheat in the world, and I can explain how that happened if you want, but it's not part of the normal image. It was also, and I believe it remains, the largest importer of sand in the world. The Saudi sand being too fine to be used for cement. At that time, Saudi Arabia was importing sand from Sweden and other places. Anyway, enough said. I think the point is that we need to be careful before we accept stereotypes, particularly those developed in a time of great emotion, and Saudi Arabia deserves a close look. I agree with Paul, by the way, that there hasn't really been any fundamental change in the interests that bind the U.S. and Saudi Arabia together. Oil, where Saudi Arabia is the swing producer, it is the only producer who can bring down prices when there is an interruption in supply, as it did when this happened with Venezuela. Saudi Arabia, which now has a production capacity of about 10 million barrels a day, will have to build that to 20 million barrels a day within 10 years, given the rate of increase of consumption here and in new markets like China. Saudi Arabia, as Paul said, is the epicenter of Islam. It makes a big difference that the Ayatollah Khomeini never got to preach in Mecca, or that Osama bin Laden is not standing there as the imam leading the prayers around the Kaaba. Moderate management of the holy places of Islam, Mecca and Medina, is very important to American interests. Also, Saudi Arabia is a little place about the size of Western Europe that happens to sit exactly between Europe and Asia. You can't fly between Europe and Asia without flying over it, and you can't get there by ship unless you go around the Cape of Good Hope without going off the coast. When I was ambassador, even before Desert Shield occurred, I found that my defense attaché was clearing some 30,000 U.S. military flights a year through Saudi airspace. So this is a strategically located territory, even if it didn't have oil and two of the holiest cities on earth. And finally, of course, since 9/11, we've acquired a very direct, urgent interest in cooperation with the Saudis on the issue of terrorism. This is because the target of Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda is Saudi Arabia, the overthrow of the Saudi monarchy and its replacement with a caliphate, a new caliphate that would embrace Egypt and Saudi Arabia and form a new nucleus of, if I may misuse the word, a crusading Islam, an Islam that would once again be aggressive and expansionist in a way that it has not been since the 8th century AD. I don't think Osama bin Laden is going to succeed at this, but his method has been to drive a wedge between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia and thereby to seek to withdraw American support from Saudi Arabia and to end cooperation between the two of us. And basically, in terms of the vilification of Saudi Arabia's image in the United States, I have to give the man high marks. Give him an A. Saudi Arabia has been successfully vilified in the United States, and to say anything kind about it is to invite a reprimand. To say anything unkind about it is to win political points. And there are underlying this, and here's where I come to, since this is SICE and you are all thinking great thoughts about how the world is organized and what happens. I think there are a set of presuppositions that underlie some of the negative image of Saudi Arabia and of Islam at the moment that need examination. For example, I hear it stated as a fact, incontrovertible axiom, that religious education, especially Islamic education in madaris or madrasas, to use the English plural, leads to violence. Religious education leads to violence. I know of no evidence for this theory at all. I suppose one could look at the Catholic education of the members of the IRA and show that Catholicism is inherently prone to blowing up department stores in London. Or one could look at the behavior of Pat Robertson, who right up to the moment that Charles Taylor was removed as president of Liberia was funneling money to the man on religious grounds, and conclude that Protestants are inherently prone to genocide. Or one could, of course, say that because whatever his name, Goldstein, who shot 53 people in a mosque in Hebron, went to a yeshiva, that therefore a Jewish religious education inclines you to mass murder. I think this is all really far-fetched. A case might be made for Islam having a similar effect on people, but I don't think it's been made. I think this is one of these wonderful unexamined propositions that passes into the conventional wisdom and is overdue for examination. Second, I think there's a sort of an assumption that Osama bin Laden, who's a sort of scruffy guy with a beard, who looks good at the supermarket checkout. I don't know if you have ever seen the Weekly World News, which periodically features pictures of Osama and his alleged gay lover, Saddam Hussein, which is actually a kind of a neat concept that only Americans could come up with. Osama bin Laden is exactly the sort of guy who graduates from a madrasa. But of course, the man's an engineer. And one of the most wonderful things, in fact, the only wonderful thing about the atrocity of 9/11 was that it allowed everybody to pick up their pet rock and attribute terrorism to that. So we're told that poverty breeds terrorism, although Osama comes from a family that is sort of the equivalent of the Rockefellers in Saudi Arabia, and certainly didn't have a deprived childhood financially. And most of the people who came here, the 15 Saudis who came and did 9/11, were from rather privileged backgrounds. And so poverty causes terrorism, environmental degradation causes terrorism, sexism causes terrorism, whatever your pet rock is, that causes terrorism. Arab culture breeds terrorism. But in fact, all of the evidence seems to me to suggest that the causes of terrorism are a combination of humiliation and the search for revenge, on the one hand, with the lack of alternative weapons. People who have F-16s don't need to blow themselves up in order to strike targets. They can do it at less cost themselves. So grievance and desperation seem to me to be at the root of it. Perhaps we ought to ask ourselves a question or two about who is the enemy. I mean, to the extent that Iraq has not eclipsed the war on terrorism, which I think in Congress it has. And Paul, I think part of the reason for the relative respite from Saudi bashing in the last couple of weeks is that it's not that we understand Saudi Arabia better or that we've done any serious thinking about Saudi Arabia or the Middle East. It's just that we're now in such trouble in Iraq that is absorbing us. And at any rate, perhaps it is too much to ask the American people, 70% of whom believe Saddam Hussein or the Iraqis did 9/11, despite the absence of any evidence of connection at all, to engage in effective reflection on this. But I think we do need to understand who the enemy is and who the enemy is not. And in this connection, the U.S. government clearly understands that Saudi Arabia is an ally in the war on terror. And the Saudis understand that they need the United States equally to combat the threat of terrorism to the kingdom. The trouble is that both governments find themselves defending the relationship against increasingly hostile publics. All of the animosity that now exists in the United States towards Saudi Arabia is fully mirrored in Saudi Arabian attitudes at the popular level toward the United States. In any event, just to wind up, I think there's a lot of evidence that the Saudis have engaged in a fair amount of soul searching. Those who doubt this should probably read the speech of Crown Prince Abdullah at the Gulf Cooperation Council in Muscat in December of 2001, which is one of the most remarkable political documents of the age, I think, in terms of its sort of recognition or its call to Arabs to stop blaming other people for their own mistakes and to look within themselves to struggle to improve a situation. Or one could look at the Beirut Initiative, which several people referred to Crown Prince's sudden reversal of longstanding policy. And he said that Saudi Arabia would be the first to normalize relations with Israel in the event of an Israeli-Palestinian peace, not the last, and that Saudi Arabia would bring the rest of the Arab world with it in that. A remarkable departure from past policy, or his proclamation of a reform charter for the Arab world. Saudi Arabia has very serious problems. It's fiscal crisis. It's got a demographic challenge that is very difficult. But it does seem to be thinking about these things. Frankly, I'd be happier if we in the United States were doing a little more intelligent thinking about the situation we've gotten ourselves into than we are. And in this connection, I don't think things like Radio Sawa, soft rock, and Lebanese pop music interspersed with the equivalent of the CBS News really, I think if you listen to that for 100 hours, you might go nuts, actually, but you might have a more favorable view of U.S. policy. But if that happened to you, all you'd have to do is turn on Fox News, which is widely available in the region, Redneck TV, live in your living room, and all of the good would be undone. Which is to say that nasty things that an imam or two might say in a mosque are more than reciprocated by nasty things that people say on television here in the United States. Perhaps we all ought to cool it. Thanks.
Thank you, Chaz. It's really been a broad exposure to a lot of interesting things to think about in the kingdom. I'd just like to add two other points that, in thinking about what we don't know or what we think we know about the kingdom that we may not think is accurate or we may not find to be accurate. There's two significant data points that always come to my mind as I think about the U.S.-Saudi interaction and the challenges that the kingdom is facing. The first is that half of all of the people, the population in Saudi Arabia, are under the age of 20. Half of all the people under the age of 20. If you can imagine.
18, I think.
18. Well, lowered even further. It gives us a couple of years to worry about it even further. But if you think about what that means in terms of social change, of pressures on education, pressures on housing, pressures on jobs, there are a lot of things in that kingdom to have to worry about. The other one is, well, perhaps the Saudis really don't understand the United States and they don't see us for what we are, and it's amazing that they can't understand why America's answers and policies aren't better appreciated. I'm always reminded that in the Saudi government, in the Saudi cabinet, there are more American-trained PhDs than there are in the American cabinet and the American Congress combined. So it's not a question of a country that doesn't understand America, doesn't know where we are coming from. With these couple of points, what I'd like to do is invite your questions for the next 35, 40 minutes. I'd like to ask you, please use the microphones at either end, not because we can't hear you speak or your colleagues, but because we're on camera and we're recording. It would be much better if we actually had you on the mics. But I invite questions from you to any single member. If you would direct your question to a member of the panel, it would help focus our discussion, and the rest of us will jump in as the Spirit moves us. So please, who'd like to have the first question? Right here, please. Please help yourself to the microphone.
This would be to any of you, but more to the ambassador who focused on the idea of humiliation. I'd agree that it's a very important role, but where do you think the root is of the humiliation in the Middle East versus, let's say, Latin America or Africa or something like that, and what could possibly be done about it?
I think the differences are clear. First of all, I would say there is generally a political problem in Western and American relationships with the Third World generally because of the hangover of colonialism. Basically, the colonial experience, especially for great civilizations like those in India or China or in the Islamic world, was a humiliation, a humiliating eclipse of traditional self-respect that caused a great deal of self-doubt and that continues to bedevil the relationship because of the resentment that it breeds. Ironically, however, before I come to the Middle East as a whole, Saudi Arabia is emphatically an exception to this. That is to say, this is the only part of the earth which was not penetrated by Western colonialism or subjected to it. It is the only traditional monarchy, non-Western traditional monarchical system that survived the era of colonialism and the modern age intact. Merchants, militaries, missionaries did not get to Riyadh. And when the West finally came to Saudi Arabia, it came as hired help. So the self-doubt that Egyptians or other Arabs might have as a result of seeing themselves subordinated to the West doesn't exist in Saudi Arabia. In fact, some of us have joked on occasion that the Saudi worldview divides people into two categories: us Saudis and potential employees. So Saudi Arabia is an exception. In the Middle East as a whole, to be blunt, the issue is almost 2,600 dead Palestinians and 40,000 maimed Palestinians out of a population of roughly 3 million. If you took the equivalent in the U.S., you could, since we have about 300 million people, you would say that this is the equivalent of 2.5 million dead in the U.S. and 40 million requiring permanent therapy, traumatic experience. Now, in Israel, the Israeli figures are roughly 850, 860 dead, which is horrible and can't be dismissed. And there are, I don't know, 5,000 or 6,000 people who have been permanently disabled in some respect as a result of the escalating war of brutality between Israelis and Palestinians. So both sides are basically experiencing a traumatic bloodbath. But on the Arab side, it's American weaponry and your tax dollars that are financing the occupation. I think when the head of the Israeli General Staff comes out and says, as he did, that the strategy that is being followed is so extreme that it is breeding hatred and terror rather than suppressing it, he's expressing a profound truth. But he's thinking in the narrow context of Israel's relationships with Palestinians. All of this is available on the nightly news, the equivalent of Fox TV, if you will, in the Arab world. 30 different television channels show graphic examples of the suffering of both Israelis and Palestinians, and it has an immediate and terribly emotional impact. We are spared that in this country, that our television censors itself and does not show those things on either side, really. The source of the humiliation is a sense of powerlessness, victimization that has roots in reality. People are dying. People are being maimed. And a final note on this, this is a very sad thing to say, but I was just in Abu Dhabi and Dubai, Doha and Riyadh, and then Taipei on the way back. But in the Arab world, if you turn on the television and watch, I don't know, Middle East Broadcasting or Arabiya or Al Jazeera or one of the other satellite stations, you will see now pictures of soldiers yelling something in an incomprehensible language and kicking down a door, going in with a gun and either shooting or leveling the gun on women and kids. And then that'll fade away and there'll be a picture of another set of soldiers yelling an incomprehensible set of orders and kicking down doors and leveling guns on people. And you don't know whether you're watching the Israeli occupation of the West Bank or the US occupation of Iraq. And the two things are melding together in people's minds out there, which is a real problem, I think, because although I have great admiration for many aspects of Israeli society, I don't admire the way in which they've conducted themselves in the West Bank and Gaza, and I don't think we should be, I'm sorry to find us confused in people's minds with some of the behavior that's gone on there.
Thank you, Chess. Tom, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I think there's one other element to take into consideration in addressing this very difficult question. If you take a landmark event in modern Middle Eastern history, let's say the 1967 war, as your jumping off place, in the lifetime of most adult Muslims and Arabs, literally tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of Muslims have died violent deaths. And the vast majority of those deaths were at the hands of other Muslims. in the war between Iran and Iraq, in the civil war in Algeria, in Black September, in clan fighting in Somalia, wherever. And many of my Arab and Muslim friends have told me over the years that, and you can read in the literature, that this is a collective failure to achieve or to live up to the ideals and the mandates of Islam and of Muslim Brotherhood that grates away at all the people of the region. And so their own sense, their own frustration at their own inability to achieve their own aspirations is compounded by all the elements that Ambassador Freeman just described, and I think that's part of it.
Question over here then.
General Schwartz, in your comments, you remarked that Saudi Arabia, you've recently seen improvements in Saudi Arabia with respect to political, social policies, and I was interested to hear you comment on any developments, positive developments, with respect to women's rights and other human rights within Saudi Arabia, since that's sort of a hot point for many people.
Sure. Admittedly, that is a focal point, and is this on? Can you hear me? That is a subject that my wife and I have spent hours and hours at over the dinner table. I happen to take a more time-sensitive view toward that. I can assure you that the Saudi leadership is very much aware of the problem and is working on the problem. There are a series of announcements that come from Saudi Arabia, either directly or through the Saudi embassy here, which highlight the number of females in Saudi Arabia, Saudi women, who own businesses, and I don't remember what the numbers are, but they were stunning. I do know that in the time that I was there was evidence of commercial activities by women, Saudi women. I would tell you that about 5 months ago, I had dinner in London. I was delighted to meet a Saudi international financier who was living and stationed in London. We had a very, very wonderful talk. She was upbeat. This is a Saudi woman, a businesswoman, a middle-aged businesswoman who was working full-time in London in international finance. She was very positive on progress that is being made. She claimed that, yes, it took a heck of a struggle. She needed her father's support to get where she was, to get the education, to get the job, but she said it's possible. It has been possible and remains possible, and she's optimistic that more and more opportunities are opening up. The anchor in that, of course, is tradition and to a large extent religion, and those anchors need to be weighed and they need to be pulled up, and that needs to be moving forward. Though I know those are generalizations with only one very positive example, but I also know that the intent of the Saudi Arabian government is to utilize that large number of Saudi talent that heretofore has been not utilized enough. So there is a recognition that those skills and talents need to be brought into the workforce, into the government, and opportunities increased for them.
Les, can I add a comment?
Please go ahead.
I don't like the way in which Saudi society practices sexual apartheid. Personally, I find that disturbing. I don't think it's a product of Islam. I think it is a product of local custom. I think in many respects it is counter to Islam. And I believe that in time it will be corrected. It will be corrected because the senior levels of the royal family historically have tried to move toward correcting it, because women want it, the more enlightened part of the female population wants it corrected. Over 50% of students in universities now in Saudi Arabia are female. So women are well educated. And there's a great tragedy in Saudi Arabia. Not only are young men underemployed or unemployed, but this vast reservoir of trained talent that lies in Saudi women is also underutilized. The result is you have 7 million expatriate workers doing things in Saudi Arabia that Saudis really ought to be doing in many cases. And I think in the long run, this will be corrected. Now, having said all that, I think there are strong internal pressures for change, and there is change occurring. We come up to a question. Crown Prince Abdullah has announced that there will be municipal elections, that half of the municipal councils will be elected, will be filled through an election within the next 12 months. A question, will women be allowed to vote in these elections? Answer, if the United States makes an issue of it, no. If Saudis are allowed to deal with it themselves, Saudi women will probably demand the vote. And the outcome will be uncertain, as indeed has been the case in Kuwait, where the parliament has not approved an expansion of women's rights on occasion. But maybe it will be like Qatar, also Wahhabi in inspiration, where women's rights have steadily expanded. So we don't know. I think what we need to do is be a bit discreet and supportive of Saudi women, but not get out ahead of them and thereby queer their chance to make the progress I think they need to make.
I would just follow up, just to echo your sentiments. I completely agree with you. I don't think that, well, and if anyone, actually studies the Quran, violation of women's rights is not taught in the Quran, exactly. And it's actually a misconception I think a lot of Americans have. While there may be a tradition of subjugation of women, there's not necessarily a religious justification for it. So I just think it's something important to remember. But thank you for your comments.
Well, the West, the most charming characteristic of our culture is our amnesia. It wasn't that long ago that women were denied the right not only to vote, but to sign contracts or own property in their own name in our society. These are rights that people have had in Islamic societies for centuries. It wasn't so long ago in our society that we had enshrined racial discrimination into law. We're not perfect. And our own ability to correct our mistakes ought to give hope that others can do the same. And I think the Saudis have some problems in this area, and they need to work on them.
I think just to make that point that you've made, Chaz, on social change, when I reported to SICE as a student my first year here in this building, which was the first year of this building, all of the African American students could not rent apartments around here until we passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And social change is just long and tough and hard, and as Chaz said, we Americans have an amnesia for how long it took us to get to where we are. Let's go over here on this side. Question, please.
Yes, you all mentioned very clearly the political and strategic and economic importance of the relationship that we have with the kingdom. And given that as a democratic society, we often believe that it is our responsibility and now justification for preemption to spread and influence democratic change around the world. Given the staggering figures of the over 50% of Saudis under the age of 18 and the media that they're able to see, do any of you actually hope for a situation in Saudi Arabia where the people are able to choose their leaders and choose what their lives are made of?
First, I don't entirely accept your premise that Americans are committed to and work toward individual liberties and human rights around the world. Part of the knock on America is that we've made common cause with some of the most unpalatable regimes in history over the past X number of years for whatever reasons we had. I would say here's a way to look at this, right? If in the unlikely event that you were to see in Saudi Arabia tomorrow the establishment of a parliamentary system such as they have in, let's say, Canada, right? I don't believe you would like the results. I think the outcome of such a process would be antithetical to everything that we hope to achieve in Saudi Arabia and the region. You wouldn't like the people who won that election. You wouldn't like their policies. You wouldn't like their attitudes toward us. and you wouldn't like what they do about the oil business. And so you ought to be careful what you wish for in life, lest you get it.
If I can add a comment to that, I think indeed it is the youth, obviously, who will determine the future of the kingdom. I think Saudi society is actually a great deal more open to change than many people imagine. The barriers between the ruling family and the common people are in some ways less than those between our elected officials and us. You can't walk into the White House and talk to George Bush if you wanted to. You couldn't do that. Everything is contrived as a photo op, and there are layers of guards, and Pennsylvania Avenue is shut down. Some of that has crept into Riyadh as a result of the terrorism problem there recently. But basically, members of the royal family routinely and government officials routinely have open house where anybody can walk in and talk to them, and people do. So I think the communication is, so the question is what will be communicated? And here I think the tragedy is that whereas there were hundreds of thousands of Saudis who studied in the United States before, there were probably 100,000 Saudi-owned homes in the United States prior to 9/11. The combination of visa procedures, humiliation at the border by border officials, not just for Saudis, by the way. I mean, yesterday I had an Iraqi businessman who's a Canadian citizen who's involved in rebuilding electric power in Iraq, who tried to get here from Toronto, was told he could not fly to Reagan because he was an immigration risk, was diverted to Chicago, was strip searched, had his business cards and the contents of his briefcase confiscated, and finally got here by way of Pittsburgh 8 hours after he was due to arrive. And he's working for American companies. You know, this is our guy. So there is a problem, and people don't come here anymore. The student population is way down. People are finishing degrees in some cases, and others have withdrawn. There are no new starts on degrees. Orlando, Disney World, which was the epicenter of Arab culture, some people thought, it's where all the Arabs were in the summer, it no longer receives Arab visitors. So you have business down, you have travel down, you have all kinds of interaction down. Americans are going out to the region in lower numbers, also because of concerns about terrorism. So, Paul struck the words from his litany, but the fact is that the human fabric of this relationship, which has given it its resilience, is fraying. And the next generation, whatever their choices about the future of Saudi Arabia may be, will make those choices in ignorance of Americans and American ways, because they will not have been exposed to us like their elders were. And I think that's too bad. I think it's a loss of influence. And frankly, I think what's made our country great is its openness, and I hate to see it become xenophobic to the extent we have.
The democratization process has been in Saudi Arabia for ages and ages, hundreds and hundreds, perhaps 1,000 years. In the process that the ambassador mentioned, where originally tribal leaders had a majlis, as the Arabic word for a meeting, and these meetings occurred on a repetitive, recurring basis. I had the good fortune to sit in every weekend, every week that he was in Riyadh and that I was in Riyadh. The doors were open for me to sit in on Crown Prince Abdullah's majlis, and it is a session that defies description. You have to be there to live it and to see it, and to see how petitioners, citizens who come in off of the street, and this happens at every level. This is not just at the royal family level. It's a leadership responsibility. So this process of petitioners or citizens coming forward with grievances, with comment, with poems, with interface, access to their leaders has happened for hundreds and hundreds of years. It goes by a different name. It's not called democratization, but it is a process of the leaders being influenced by the population. And it happens at all levels. It happens regionally. It happens not just in Riyadh, but throughout Saudi Arabia. The Majlis still is a going concern.
Thanks, Paul. Question from over here.
Good afternoon. My question is really directed to the panel as a whole. In your opinion, does the current Saudi government want the U.S. to succeed in Iraq? And if so, why? I guess a different way to ask this question would be, how would a democratic Iraq benefit the current Saudi regime?
On the, may I start just
Please,
one
Paul.
comment? On the 24 hours after the U.S. Went into Iraq, I was called by a reasonably prominent Saudi Arabian, a general officer in the Saudi military forces, and he called me at home, and he said, Paul, he said, it's something that has to be done. He said it will be a short war and a long peace. I'll never forget his words. Does he represent the Saudi Arabian government? I can't say that he does. He called more as a friend, but clearly his attitudes and opinions reflect his cohort. He's not going to go out and take something that's diametrically opposed to the environment in which he lives. So at least in my narrow snapshot, I sensed certainly this individual's support and appreciation for what was happening, but not a very optimistic look to the future.
I think the question is, what is success in Iraq? I don't think there's any consensus in the United States on that, and I don't think there's a consensus internationally. There have been at least 6 different reasons given for going into Iraq, regime change. Well, we've done regime removal. That's half of regime change. The other half, which is putting a new regime in, we're having trouble figuring out how to do. Weapons of mass destruction, we proved to our surprise that the inspectors had done an incredibly good job of getting rid of those. So we accomplished that mission, no weapons of mass destruction. Democratization may be turning out to be desecularization in Iraq. That is the empowerment of religious factions and parties at the expense of the secular traditions of Iraq, which is a very secular government traditionally. We don't know. Improving the standard of living of the Iraqi people, so far a failure. Changing the overall pattern of relationships in the Middle East. The President gave a speech yesterday suggesting this was combined with democratization. In the end, this is the reason we're in Iraq. So far, I haven't noticed any improvement. Maybe it'll come in time. And finally, terrorism. Bring them on confronts terrorists who seem to think our presence in Iraq is a convenience rather than a threat, because we've brought a lot of targets within range. And jihadis are using GIs as target practice. And Iraq is a training ground now for terrorists, apparently, which it wasn't before. So what's success? I'm not sure. Is Iraq likely to be a democracy in any fundamental sense in the near term? Probably not. If it is it a threat or a benefit to Saudi Arabia? Probably neither. I mean, I don't really think it's a threat. I don't think it's a benefit, particularly. So I don't know how to answer your question, because I'm not quite sure how you define success, is what I'm saying.
I would just, let me conclude by saying, turn it around. I don't think the Saudis would want to see an abject U.S. failure in Iraq.
No.
For the simple reason is that Saudi strategic policy for the last 50 years or more has been based upon American strength, and they're sheltering under the umbrella of that strength. And it's the basic strategic equation that was launched by King Abdulaziz and President Roosevelt, the first meeting there in the Red Sea, where basically they would provide a stable supply of energy, and we would provide the strategic protection. And if the United States failed and was perceived by the whole world to fail in Iraq, that would weaken the very strength that the Saudis look to in terms of their own security, and would have to look elsewhere where they would go or what they would have to do to compensate for the loss of that. If you figure it's a very large country, almost half the size of the United States, has a very small population, extended borders, lots of unfriendly people all around them, they need a strong friend. So I think they would not want to see us fail. Let's go over here on this side, please.
Thank you. Ask the panel. One of Osama bin Laden's bill of particulars at the time of the attack on the World Trade Center was the what he referred to as the occupation of the holy places of Saudi Arabia by the U.S. Two questions about that. The first is, to what extent is that, in fact, a concern, something that you'd hear about if you were in Saudi Arabia? Was that an issue? And secondly, the obvious question, now that the U.S. has withdrawn, I understand, all U.S. forces from Saudi Arabia, has that in fact resonated? Is this now seen as something favorable, or rather worse? Is it something that looks as if the U.S. conceded a point to Osama bin Laden? Appreciate comments.
Well, I begin by saying that I made an extensive trip there just about a year ago. I heard many complaints about many subjects from many Saudis at many different levels. None of them involved the holy places. It's not true that Americans occupy the holy places, if Mecca and Medina are what you call the holy places. No, Americans didn't go anywhere near them. They were concentrated over in Riyadh and over in the Eastern Province. It's true that the presence of any foreign troops on any part of Saudi soil is a neuralgic issue for a certain element of the Saudi population. And I think it's probably just as well for both countries, for the United States and Saudi Arabia, that we've shut down the operation now at Al-Kharj and moved those units out of there. But I think that to the extent that the presumed defiling of the holy places was part of the indictment, I think that was a phony issue.
I don't think the issue really ever has been the physical presence of Americans in the way that your question implies, Frank, because I think it's a different and more fundamental question. Of course, Osama bin Laden's objections to the monarchy and to the American connection of the monarchy became acute during Desert Shield and Desert Storm, when he proposed that instead of inviting U.S. forces to the kingdom to defend the kingdom and then liberate Kuwait, that he be allowed to organize mujahideen, as he had done in Afghanistan, and handle the problem that way without foreign assistance, something that was totally unrealistic and correctly rejected by everyone in Saudi Arabia. His view represents that of a very tiny minority in the kingdom. But the theory by which he objects is not the physical presence. He says, in Islam, the duty of the monarch, of the king, of the leader of the country is to lead the Islamic community toward righteousness. It is to set a moral example and to fulfill the interests of pious people. And it is his contention that the monarchy's connection with the United States, a secular, non-Muslim society, actually a religious society with a secular government, but a non-Muslim society by and large, has perverted this role and thereby made the monarchy in Saudi Arabia illegitimate. And so his objection to the monarchy comes from this. I think this is all twaddle, frankly, but that is the case that he makes, and I can tell you that not many people in Saudi Arabia accept it.
The forces that were withdrawn were those air forces that were in place after the first Gulf War to enforce the no-fly zone. They were operating out of a Air Force base 30 or 40 miles south of Riyadh for many, many years, enforcing that no-fly zone. That became a focal point here recently. That mission ended. Those Air Force forces and the ground support troops were withdrawn. The historical advisory group of U.S. military has not withdrawn. The U.S. military training mission, relatively small, 30 or 40 people maybe, uniformed military, remains in place as advisors to the Ministry of Defense and Aviation. The military attaché section at the embassy remains in place. And numbers-wise, the most significant is the advisory group to the Saudi Arabian National Guard. They've not only remained in place, but they've, at the direction of the Crown Prince, picked up additional requests and missions to do analytical work on the continuing modernization of the National Guard. And in fact, their numbers have grown a bit, not very much, but they bring in specialists to do a job and then they go home. And that's very important when you consider that they respond to Crown Prince Abdullah. He's the one that keeps that U.S. presence. That 25-year presence there is still there and doing its job in a very good way.
Good. Let's question over here, please.
I would have two short questions concerning the American military presence in the region. The first one is directed to General Schwartz. Is it wise for the U.S. to move all troops out of Saudi Arabia and into Iraq? And if so, what are the consequences for Saudi security and implications for the society? Second question is directed to Ambassador Freeman. And I would like you to shed some light on the elements of the Saudi society that actually don't want the U.S. to succeed, so to speak, to fail in Iraq. Which elements of society favor an American failure, and especially in the light of jihadi fighters infiltrating into Iraq over the Saudi border? Thank you.
There has not been a movement of U.S. military forces from Saudi Arabia to Iraq. The numbers of forces of U.S. military forces in Saudi Arabia, those two training assistance organizations that I mentioned, never numbered over 150 or 175, and large numbers of that were civilian Department of the Army technical assistance types. So the numbers of U.S. ground forces that have been in Saudi Arabia since the end of the first Gulf War, for the last 12, 13 years, those forces from the first Gulf War left very quickly after that war was over. Within weeks, they were heading back, and within a couple of months, that movement out of Saudi Arabia was completed, and that brought the total numbers down, except for that Air Force contingent operating to enforce the no-fly zone. Now, they have gone, but they didn't go to Iraq. There has been no movement of U.S. troops from the U.S. To Iraq. Should there be a prolonged presence of U.S. forces in Iraq, I do not see that in itself would unbalance or affect the relationship with Saudi Arabia. Certainly it depends what they're up to and what their mission is and what their perceived mission is. That could have an impact, but just the fact that they're operating up there, I do not think would have a bad effect on a relationship with Saudi Arabia.
Chaz?
First, just a minor comment on that. Historically, the U.S. has not stationed combat forces in Saudi Arabia in normal times. After the withdrawal of the Strategic Air Command installations to which Tom referred, there was a long period with no U.S. combat presence in Saudi Arabia at all. And indeed, that presence began August 7, 1990, after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, and it lasted much longer, frankly, than it should have, in my view. But one of the salutary results of the Iraq invasion by U.S. forces was that we were able to remove the forces in Saudi Arabia that had been conducting Southern Watch, the air campaign in southern Iraq. And that's all to the good, and I don't think it's a detriment. I think it's a positive thing that those forces are not in the kingdom anymore. As for who in Saudi society wishes failure for the United States in Iraq, I'm glad you asked the question, because I was in Riyadh about 2 weeks ago, I guess, and actually the dominant concern of people there is that the U.S. will fail, and I'm grateful to Les for his earlier comments on that. That is, nobody really favored the United States going into Iraq. Polls showed that the opposition was on the level of 97%, virtually unanimous. But since the U.S. is there, the worst thing that could possibly happen, I think, from the Saudi point of view, and I think from an American point of view, is that we abandon the place to its fate. Having smashed it, we leave it broken and to find its own course. The United States was a little bit in going into Iraq, I think, in some ways resembled a dog chasing a car. You know, the dog is very enthusiastic about the chase and really hasn't thought what it's going to do with the car when and if it catches it. And it turns out dogs don't drive cars very well. And so I'm not really surprised that we're having a hard time. We need to figure out what to do with Iraq. We need to be responsible in dealing with it. And in that connection, I think, to go back to the issue of democratization in Iraq, the best thing we could do would be the speediest possible true democratization of Iraq. I mean, to the extent Iraq can be democratized, let's do it quickly, as quickly as we can, and not have a presence, a military occupation force stuck in Iraq for a long time. Now, who in Saudi Arabia would like to see, what would the opposition like to see? Some of them would like to see us bogged down in Iraq for the very reason I mentioned. This provides convenient American targets close at hand. You don't have to fly an aircraft into the World Trade Center. You can pick up a rifle, walk across the desert, and find lots of Americans to kill. Some others in Saudi Arabia probably be very happy to see the jihadi element in Saudi Arabia among Saudi youth go off to Iraq and get killed. So Iraq could be sort of thought of as a kind of flypaper for jihadis. You know, they fly in and they get stuck there, and then they perish under fire from an M16. But I think, broadly speaking, Saudis are probably just as confused about Iraq as everybody else, and there's not a very clear view one way or the other, except fear of American failure.
Thanks, Chaz. Question over here, and let me ask, we have 3 questions left. Let's make those the last questions, since our panel has been very generous giving up its lunch hour. Let's finish with these 3 questions, please. Go ahead.
I'd like to hear the comments of the panel on the following issue. In the past, it has been said by some observers that American foreign policy used to have different levels of actions and different final goals, and sometimes a contrast among them, especially for what concerned the Middle East. They said that you have the Department of State strategy, the Department of Defense strategy, the CIA strategy, and then the private companies. What do you think of this idea of different lines of actions for what concerns American foreign policy in the Middle East, and sometimes contrast among them? And do you think that this peculiar dynamic has affected U.S.-Saudi relations in the past?
How much time do you have? I would offer a suggestion. I mean, you know, the idea that different parts of the U.S. government, different elements of American society have different views, different aspirations, and espouse different techniques for achieving certain goals in any region of the world. It's true, and it recurs from time to time. It's like reading those articles in the New York Times about the dispute between the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State. I think it was true even when Kissinger held both jobs. In the diplomatic archives of 1951, in the State Department archives, you'll find a very interesting document called a Comprehensive Statement of U.S. Policy Toward the Kingdom. And with the exception of the parts about containing communism and the Cold War, the policies and aspirations for Saudi Arabia laid out in that very extensive 1951 document were and have been and are pretty much an accurate summary of U.S. policies and aspirations towards Saudi Arabia. I don't think things are as consistent and fragmented over time as your question suggests.
I would echo that. In Saudi Arabia, which is the only country I have experience with, the ambassador, the U.S. ambassador, is the person, is the go-to person, the guy in charge, call him whatever you want to, for all of the U.S. efforts, whether they're businessmen in there trying to create or close a deal, or whether it's a U.S. Army advisory team. The ambassador is the person that everybody in there goes to, and he coordinates those activities. And it's done through meetings, it's done through emails, it's done through personal contacts, it's done through all the traditional ways of doing business. I have not did not find any inconsistencies in that. Certainly individuals might fly off the handle, might get themselves, out of it and lead to some small, minor, temporary problems. But the vast majority of the effort is coordinated by the ambassador through the state. Now, I'd be interested on the following: what happens when a thing like Desert Storm comes along? How does that transition, and what's that role? And I would kind of ask the ambassador maybe to comment.
Well, I was going to say there's a very simple answer to this. When I was in charge there, everything was coordinated. There were no problems at all. And since I've left, it's all fallen apart. Seriously, I think your question relates to a much broader problem in American foreign policy than just Saudi Arabia or the Middle East. I have developed a theory of how American foreign policy is made in the post-Cold War era, which I will briefly share with you for whatever it's worth. During the Cold War, I think there was a general realization by Americans that our national survival and identity was at stake. We could be obliterated. And President Kennedy, as I recall, said, if I make a mistake in domestic policy, it can embarrass me, but if I make a mistake in foreign policy, it could kill us all. And there was a sense, therefore, that the stakes were very high and that foreign policy ought to be made in a way that was different from domestic policy. Domestic policy, we evolved mechanisms in the Congress and in interaction between the administration and the Congress over decades, by which basically increasingly we franchised interest groups with policies. Whichever interest group was most affected by a policy or cared most intensely about it would get to make the policy and appoint the people to administer it. So we have all kinds of monuments to this sort of franchise, policy by franchise around the government. We have a Bureau of Handicapped Affairs, we have a Bureau of Minority Business Affairs, we have, they're always, and the Handicapped Bureau is always run by a handicapped person, and the Minority Business Administration is always run by an African American, and so forth and so on. And so we did this in domestic policy, but we didn't, and to some extent in foreign policy. After the end of the Cold War, people said, hey, if I screw up foreign policy, what difference is it going to make? No one's out there who can destroy us. And I think there was a sense that therefore you could do it just like domestic policy. So we started franchising. The Save the Whales people got Norway. The non-proliferators got Korea. Depending on the. You get to a subject like China, there are too many interest groups involved, so we had to do time sharing. So 1 week the Dalai Lama would get it, and the next week it would be the president of Taiwan, and then the Christian right, and the anti-abortion crowd, and the copyright lawyers. And so so this is American democracy at work, projecting domestic interests abroad, and even Saudi Arabia is not immune to this, but I think I probably said enough. You can figure out the theory by yourselves.
I don't think we can add much to that. Let's question over here, please.
Have any of you read or heard author Joel Mowbray recently, who has addressed criticism of the State Department for immediately after 9/11 seeming to make a top priority the reassurance to the Saudis that the favored treatment Saudi citizens had received from the U.S. government would continue and not to believe otherwise? And also, I'm wondering has anyone been in contact or communication with bin Laden family members other than Osama, who so quietly, secretly, and quickly were returned to Saudi Arabia after 9/11 with U.S. help?
Well, I certainly have been in touch with some of Osama's brothers who are good friends, and Some of them stopped by my office before they left the country, escorted by the FBI. On the State Department and the administration promising to continue good treatment of Saudis. If they said that, they lied, because Saudis are routinely roughed up at airports and have a hell of a time getting visas. As for the bin Laden family, Osama has 23 brothers and 27 sisters. I don't know any of the sisters. I know some of the brothers. Unfortunately, Osama inherited the family ability without inheriting the very nice character and demeanor of the other brothers. These are people who are international business folk who are who anybody would be happy to do business with. And I've said to Bakr bin Laden, who is the head of the family, that I feel his pain. I have a half-brother, a wicked half-brother who, when he comes around, I lock up the silver and send the women away. And bad as my half-brother is, he's nothing by comparison with what they've had to put up with in terms of a black sheep in the family. So I think we have to be very careful. If one Rockefeller turned out to be a bank robber, it wouldn't mean that all of them were. And I think we have to be very careful in looking at this. I don't know of any special treatment for Saudis other than special scrutiny by the airport security people at the present time.
Thanks. Last question over here, please.
Mr. Ambassador, you discussed how there's no evidence indicating a correlation between religious education, ideologies, and violence. That issue aside, there's been a lot of talk about Saudi Arabia's direct role in terrorist financing. Mm-hmm. Is there any truth to these allegations? And if so, what is the most constructive way for the U.S. to go about engaging them in this issue?
Well, I think historically the Saudis have been sort of ideal donors to charity in the sense that they give money without strings, and they very seldom inquire about what was done with the money. And this, in effect, made the Saudis on occasion sitting ducks for money to be siphoned off. And I believe that, in fact, there was a lot of giving from Saudi Arabia that went into charitable activities, where some of the charitable activities, in fact, were not done. Well, they thought they were giving money to build a mosque, and there was somebody maybe connected to Al Qaeda in the group that was siphoning money off. Having said that, I'll make two comments. First, I don't think the amount of money involved is very large. I think it's vastly overestimated, and 9/11 supposedly, the whole operation supposedly cost $300,000 or $500,000, pick your number. But anyway, not a large amount of money. And so the role of money may be less important than people imagine. And second, to the extent there was a problem, the Saudis have moved very vigorously to correct it. In fact, they had begun to do so at the beginning of the 90s. And 94 in particular, and in 98 again, in response to problems caused by Al Qaeda. After 9/11, all of the irony is that the U.S. government's cooperation with the Saudis in this area has been superb. And the Saudis are doing things that we would never do. For example, I mentioned the IRA. The IRA can still collect in the United States. You can't collect for a foreign charity in Saudi Arabia anymore. It's all funneled through a single organization that's government controlled. When I worked on the African Bureau, I don't want to keep bringing up the Christian right, but there was a group called Renamo in Mozambique, which at the time was a sort of African Khmer Rouge. They had mutilated 500,000 people and killed another 500,000. This was started by Ian Smith in Rhodesia, picked up by South African intelligence, and it eventually was brought into a peace process and integrated with the government. But during the period when they were on the rampage, they were getting money from right-wing Christian groups in the United States. We have in Sudan a proxy war going on between Muslims supported with Muslim charity and Christians and animists supported with Christian charity. So, and we don't control this. In the case of Renamo, Ronald Reagan called Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell, I believe, and asked them to stop this, and they wouldn't. So the Saudis have now controlled the thing in a way that we won't, and I think they deserve credit for what they've done. Without anybody claiming that they were perfect in the past or that they're perfect now, they've come a hell of a long way. And everyone in the government who deals with them on this issue repeatedly expresses satisfaction with the progress that's been made and with the general attitude of cooperation the Saudis evince. I'm not surprised by that because, again, the target of Al-Qaeda is Saudi Arabia. We are a means to the end. We're not the main target. So they have every reason in their own interest to clamp down. I guess I should make one last comment, and that is Saudi Arabia is often criticized, justly in my view, of being very unkind to dissidents. It is said that in the preferred investigative technique of the Ministry of Interior is to take fingernails, not fingerprints. Maybe that's right, maybe it's wrong. But the fact is that Saudi Arabia is not kind to dissidents. And the idea that it would somehow be kind to people who go beyond dissent to active efforts to overthrow the system by attacks on innocent civilians just boggles the imagination. So I think there has been a fair amount of sort of ignorant speculation about this area. There are problems. They've largely been fixed. As problems are discovered in the future, there's every reason to believe they will be addressed.
I think...
Tom, you want to have a last comment?
I just want to add one point. I think if you go back to the 1979, which was the most traumatic year in modern Saudi history, ending with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, that was the year in which a group of extremely fanatical terrorists took over the Great Mosque in Mecca. And so for the first time, you saw, in effect, the House of Saud being challenged and outflanked from the right, so to speak. Right? And they were determined not to let that happen again, especially since Khomeini, by that time, was in full rhetorical flower across the Gulf. And I think it's fair to say that the ruling House of Saud, the regime, gave a free hand to some of the most retrograde elements in Saudi society in an attempt to bolster its own credentials as upholders of Islam and religion, with some of the consequences that we've since seen. They were, I think you could even make the case that they were negligent to the point of criminality, at some points. There's a massive correction that's now underway as a result of what you've seen in the last 2 years.
Okay. Paul, do you want to have a last comment of any kind?
No, I'm okay, thanks.
All right, well, let me again thank SAIS for hosting this event. I think I enjoyed listening to all the comments. I hope you did. I thank you all for your really very good, serious questions and your interest and your patience, and I hope we can come back again someday, but thank you so much. Let's thank you.
Like the rest of the
Sunday, Senator John McCain talks about